There's a conversation that comes up again and again among people who are interested in Norse mythology. Marvel's Thor isn't accurate. Thor is too goofy. Thor is too human. Thor jokes too much. Thor is portrayed as an idiot sometimes. Marvel has changed the gods beyond recognition. And honestly, some of those criticisms are completely fair. If you're looking for a historically or mythologically accurate portrayal of the Norse gods, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is absolutely not the place to start. Marvel's Thor is a superhero character inspired by a figure from Norse mythology. He isn't supposed to be a perfect recreation of the Thor found in the Eddas. But today I want to play devil's advocate. Because perhaps we're sometimes so focused on what Marvel gets wrong about Thor that we forget to appreciate what these films have actually achieved. And perhaps more importantly, we've forgotten who these films are actually for. Because these aren't films made exclusively for adults who have spent years studying Norse mythology. They're films made for everyone, including children. And that matters. Thor doesn't always have to be serious. Pardon me. Let's start with the biggest criticism. Thor is sometimes ridiculous. He's arrogant. He's immature. He makes jokes. He gets himself into embarrassing situations. And particularly in Thor Ragnarok, he can be downright hilarious. But here's the thing. Why is that automatically a bad thing? Thor has always had elements of humour within the mythology. The surviving Norse stories aren't simply solemn religious texts where everyone stands around speaking dramatically about fate. There are insults, absurd situations, trickery, humiliation, and some genuinely funny moments. Thor himself gets caught up in ridiculous situations. There's the famous story where Thor dresses as Freya in order to retrieve Mjolnir from the giant. And let's be honest, a god of thunder being forced to dress as a bride because Loki has to help him recover his stolen hammer is not exactly the most serious image imaginable. So when Marvel allows Thor to be funny, that isn't necessarily completely alien to the spirit of the mythology. Marvel exaggerates it, certainly, but humour isn't something Marvel invented out of nowhere. But Marvel's Thor is also a character with trauma, and this is where I think something gets overlooked. Thor's humour isn't always there simply because Marvel wants to turn him into a joke. Thor actually goes through an enormous character journey. At the beginning of the MCU, Thor is arrogant. He's powerful, entitled, and reckless. He believes that being strong means he deserves to rule. And then Odin takes his powers away and sends him to Earth. Thor has to learn humility. He has to learn compassion. He has to understand what it means to be worthy. And then his world gets progressively torn apart. His mother dies. His father dies. His relationship with Loki becomes increasingly complicated. Asgard is destroyed. He loses Mjolnir. He loses an eye. He loses Heimdall. He loses his brother Loki twice. He fails to stop Thanos. And then he spends years carrying that failure. By Avengers Endgame, Thor isn't simply the comic relief. He's traumatized. He's depressed. He's carrying an enormous guilt. And yes, he is also still funny. But perhaps that's actually part of what makes the character interesting. People don't respond to trauma in one single way. Sometimes people cry. Sometimes they become angry. Sometimes they withdraw. And sometimes they make jokes. Humour can be a coping mechanism. Thor became increasingly ridiculous doesn't necessarily mean the writers don't take him seriously. Sometimes it means they're showing us a character who is desperately trying to cope with everything that has happened to him. And then there's something we really need to remember. These movies are for kids too. I think this is the part of the conversation that sometimes gets lost or overlooked. Adults can watch Marvel movies. Norse pagans can watch Marvel movies. Mythology enthusiasts can watch Marvel movies. Comic book fans can watch these movies. But they're made for children too, so they can watch them as well, and that is why they are comical and goofy at times. But the fact that children are able to watch them is actually rather wonderful. Imagine being 8 or 9 years old and watching Thor for the first time. You can see this enormous character with a magical hammer. You see lightning. You see gods. You see Asgard. You see Loki. You see Odin. You see Heimdall. You see giant wolves, dragons, monsters, and worlds connected by the Bifrost. And you think, this is amazing. Then perhaps that child grows up. Maybe they become interested in mythology. Maybe they pick up a book about Norse mythology. Maybe they discover the Poetic Edda. Maybe they learn about Odin, Thor, Frigg, Freya, Loki, and the other gods. Maybe they discover that the stories are considerably stranger and darker than the Marvel films. And suddenly, Marvel has become a gateway. It introduced them to the characters. Marvel doesn't have to be the destination. And I think this is an important distinction. Marvel doesn't have to be the final authority on Norse mythology. It could simply be the doorway. Nobody expects Percy Jackson, for example, to be a completely accurate representation of Greek mythology. Nobody expects Disney's Hercules to be a perfect recreation of Hercules. Nobody expects every version of Robin Hood to accurately represent medieval history. Stories evolve, myths evolve, characters get reinterpreted, and Marvel's Thor is simply another interpretation. The mistake is assuming that someone enjoying Marvel Thor means They believe Marvel Thor is exactly what ancient Norse people believed. It doesn't. Someone can love Marvel's Thor and love the mythological Thor at the same time. And actually, Marvel has introduced millions of people to Norse names. Think about how unusual some of these names once were to the average person. Odin, Thor, Loki, Frigga, Heimdall, Sif, Valkyries, Mjolnir, Asgard, Ragnarok, Yggdrasil. These words are now recognised by millions of people around the world. Of course, Marvel has altered many of them, but it has also helped make people curious. And curiosity is incredibly valuable, because mythology survives when people continue telling the stories. The Norse gods don't need to be protected inside a museum case. They need people to remain interested in them. And if a 9-year-old discovers Thor because of Marvel, and then 20 years later becomes fascinated with the actual Norse sources, is that really something we should complain about? I'd argue it's quite the opposite. Maybe we should stop expecting Marvel to make a documentary. There's another thing worth remembering. Marvel is not making educational documentaries about Viking Age religion. They're making superhero films. The MCU is a shared fictional universe containing aliens, time travel, talking raccoons or rabbits, artificial intelligence, alternate dimensions, and people who can turn into giant green rage monsters. Expecting it to suddenly become a completely accurate representation of pre-Christian Norse religion, is probably setting ourselves up for disappointment. Marvel's job is to tell an entertaining story, and sometimes entertainment requires exaggeration. Sometimes it requires comedy. Sometimes it requires changing characters. Sometimes it requires taking an ancient figure and putting them into a modern superhero narrative. That doesn't mean we have to accept every creative decision. We can absolutely criticize them, but perhaps criticism and appreciation don't have to be enemies. And let's talk about Thor himself. Because underneath all the jokes, Marvel's Thor actually retains some surprisingly recognizable characteristics. He's incredibly powerful. He's associated with thunder and lightning. He wields Mjolnir. He's a warrior. He protects others. He's associated with Asgard. He fights giants and monsters. He's stubborn. He's courageous. He's prone to getting himself into trouble. And perhaps most importantly, he is someone who repeatedly throws himself into danger to protect other people. That heroic protector aspect is something that feels very appropriate for a modern interpretation of Thor. Marvel didn't simply take the name Thor and create an entirely unrelated character. They took elements of the mythological figure and built something new around them. And honestly, I like that Thor is sometimes a complete idiot, because it makes his growth more noticeable. If Thor started the MCU as perfect, wise and humble god, where would the character arc go? He wouldn't have anywhere to go. Instead, we get someone who starts out believing that power makes him worthy. And eventually he learns that worthiness isn't about power. That's a pretty good lesson. And it's one that children can understand. That's another reason I don't think we should automatically dismiss the humour. A child watching Thor being arrogant, making mistakes and getting humbled can actually learn something from that. They can see that being strong isn't enough. Being powerful isn't enough. Being important isn't enough. What matters is what you do with those things. That's a pretty decent message to give a kid. The Marvel generation might become the next generation of mythology lovers. And this is probably my biggest argument. Every generation discovers mythology through something. Some people discover it through books, some through school, some through video games, some through fantasy novels, some through television, some through Assassin's Creed, and some through Marvel. That's okay. In fact, it's fantastic. Because mythology isn't supposed to belong exclusively to academics, historians, or religious specialists. Stories belong to people. They get retold. They get adapted. They get changed. They get reinterpreted. And then sometimes those new versions inspire people to go backwards and discover the original stories. That's how culture stays alive. We could be heathens and still enjoy Marvel. And I think this is particularly important for modern heathens. You don't have to choose. You don't have to say, I believe in the Norse gods, therefore I can't enjoy Marvel. Nor do you have to pretend Marvel is exactly what the Norse believed. You can simply say, Marvel is Marvel. It's entertainment. It's fiction. It's an interpretation. And it still can be meaningful. You can laugh at Thor being ridiculous in one film and sit at your altar and contemplate the mythological Thor afterwards. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. You can appreciate Anthony Hopkins' Odin while knowing perfectly well that Marvel's Odin is not identical to Odin of the surviving Norse sources. You can enjoy Loki while knowing that Marvel's Loki is dramatically different from the Loki of the mythology. And you can love Mjolnir in the MCU while appreciating what the hammer meant within the historical and archaeological context of the Viking Age. There's room for all of it. So perhaps we should cut Marvel some slack. Does Marvel get Norse mythology right? No. But perhaps that's not the right question. Maybe the better question is, what has Marvel done for these characters? It has taken figures from an ancient religious tradition and put them in front of billions of people. It has made children excited about gods whose names were written down more than 1,000 years ago. It has made people ask questions. It has made people search for Asgard. It has made people wonder who Odin was. It has made people curious about Mjolnir. It has made people discover Ragnarok. And some of those people will eventually go further. They'll discover the Eddas. They'll discover archaeology. They'll discover the history of Germanic religion. And some may even find their own spiritual path. All because they once watched a ridiculous man with a hammer shouting, "Bring me Thanos!" And honestly, that's not such a bad legacy. Final thoughts. As heathens, mythology enthusiasts and adults, we're perfectly entitled to criticise Marvel's interpretation of Thor. We can point out inaccuracies. We can discuss the differences. We can explain what the historical and mythological sources actually tell us. But perhaps we should also remember something incredibly important. These stories aren't just ours. They're not just exclusively for adults. They're not exclusively for heathens. They're not exclusively for historians. They're for everyone who finds something fascinating about them. And if a child watches Marvel's Thor and thinks, "I want to learn more about that," then perhaps we shouldn't be standing there telling them, "Oh no, actually Marvel got it wrong." Perhaps we should say, "Yeah, Marvel's version is pretty cool, isn't it? Now let me tell you about the Thor from the old stories." Because that's how you pass mythology on, not by demanding that everyone discover it in exactly the same way we did, but by letting people find the door and then encouraging them to walk through it. So yes, Marvel's Thor is goofy. He's sometimes ridiculous. He's occasionally an absolute disaster of a man. And he's nothing like a completely accurate reconstruction of the Norse god Thor. But maybe that's okay. Because somewhere, right now, there's probably a kid watching Thor for the first time. And they don't care whether the costume is historically accurate. They don't care whether the mythology has been changed. They just see a god with a hammer, lightning in his hands, and a story that makes them want to know more. And perhaps one day, that kid will pick up a book about Norse mythology. Perhaps they'll discover the old stories. Perhaps they'll discover the Eddas. Perhaps they'll become fascinated by the culture that produced them. Perhaps they'll become an historian. Perhaps they'll become a heathen. Or perhaps they'll simply grow up remembering that Thor was a character who first made mythology feel magical. And if that's what Marvel gives the next generation, maybe we should be grateful for it. Because the gods don't become less important because someone tells their story differently. They become forgotten when nobody tells their stories at all. And if Marvel helps keeps people talking about Thor, Odin, Loki, Mjolnir, Asgard and Ragnarok, then perhaps, despite all its inaccuracies, Marvel has done something rather important. It has kept the thunder rolling.